Good day, grade 12 learners. Welcome to today's Life Sciences lesson. My name is Sina Sekheche. This lesson is brought to you by the Gauteng Department of Education in collaboration with Saibono Discovery Center. Right, today you can send us your questions on WhatsApp on this number 079 454 9535. I'm going to repeat the number. It's 079 454 9535. And today's topic is Introduction to Evolution. Right. Like we always do, first thing that you do before you start any topic or before you tackle any topic, you consult your exam guideline. Your exam guideline is the scope that tells you what you need to study for that particular topic and what the examiner is going to ask you at the end of the year. So let us take a look at what the exam guideline tells us to study or to cover for this topic. So the first thing that you need to check, which paper does your topic fall in? So when you check here, you see that evolution forms part of your paper 2. And check the marks, the mark allocation there. It's 54 marks. So these are very, very huge marks. So you cannot play with this topic. You need to make sure that you collect as much marks as possible or as many marks as possible. Then, what do you need to know? What is it that you are expected to know in this topic? The first thing that you need to know, which is very, very, very important, as there are many definitions of evolution out there, you need to be able to know the definition of biological evolution, which is the change in the characteristics of species over time. Then we're going to look later into how are you expected to define the term evolution as a biological evolution. Then you need to know what is a hypothesis and a theory, the differences between a hypothesis and a theory. You may enter the exam knowing that. The third thing that you need to know is the theory of evolution is regarded as a scientific theory since various hypotheses relating to evolution have been tested and verified over time. That is under the introduction of evolution. Then the evidence for evolution. What is it that you need to know under this topic? You need to know the role of the following as evidence for evolution. So how were the fossil records used to provide evidence for evolution? Biogeography, and you're going to link those to your grade 10's work. Then modification by descent, where you check your homologous structures. Genetics, how was genetics used to provide evidence for evolution? So you must know all of that. Then variation, you must be able to define or give a definition of a biological species and a population. Another thing is you must be able to have a review of the contribution of each of the following variation that exist amongst individuals of the same species. That is meiosis, that is crossing over at meiosis, random arrangement of chromosomes, mutations, random fertilization, and random mating. So how all those sources of variation contribute. Then you need to know the types of variation. Then what are the types of variation? Continuous variation here. Those characteristics where there is a range of intermediate phenotypes, example, like height. You cannot have tall or short only. There's an intermediate between those. This continuous variation, those characteristics that fall into distinct categories, like blood groups. It's either that or something else. So this is your exam guideline on this particular topic that we are covering today. So getting right into it, we're going to check what is evolution. I would like for you to take a look at that picture and just digest it for 2 seconds. Now you see things, organisms changing. Now, the process that have transformed life on Earth from its earliest forms to the vast diversity that characterizes life on Earth today, that is evolution. Now, that is just evolution in its general term. And remember, these changes are not just phenotypically or they're not just outside. The change happens in the genes. So the genes, remember when you were doing your genetics, you check that what is your genotype influences your phenotype. It's what gives you your phenotype. So that change that you see on the outside is actually brought about by the genes. Right. So now we're going to define. Please take note of this definition. The exam guideline requires you to be able to know how or what is biological evolution. Now, we're going to look at this whole lot of sentence here and dissect it so that you can be able to understand it and know what biological evolution means. And this is how you refer to it now, biological evolution. Now, biological evolution, it is a process. It can be gradual or rapid in modern times by which populations, now the word here populations, change over time into a different or more complex form. Now, this process can be rapid or it can be gradual. But what is happening in this process? The populations that you see here, they change over time into a more different or into a more complex form. It is the in response to the change in their immediate environment. So the environment also plays a factor in what changes an organism. So when you define your term biological evolution, all these aspects must be part of your answer. Going back, what is biological evolution? It is the process by which populations change over time into a different or more complex forms. It is in response to change in their immediate environment. Now, what does that mean? Now, this means that all present-day life forms have descended from, digest this. Remember, descended coming from ancestors, meaning ancestors. We descend from, we come from. So to descend from is to come from. So it means that all present-day life forms have descended from and are related to those that lived in the past. We're going to look at this in detail. We're going to dissect this statement also. Now, it does not mean if they descend or they are related, they must look the same. They may look different because they become modified. Remember, the environment plays a role in bringing about the change. So from one generation to another, they become modified. But when you look at where they come from or where they descended to, there may be some similar characteristics that show or that can give evidence that these organisms are related or these organisms have descended from. So if you take a look at the diagram below here, you see there's a diagram of horse, a modern horse. Most of you today are familiar with this modern horse. This is how a normal horse looks like. But when you take a look at this first organism here, you can see it was smaller, but shaped like a horse. It has four legs. You can see. Now, with evolution, we are allowed to say now, this organism here may have descended from this one because, or it may be related to this one. But it does not necessarily mean it is exactly or it looks the same as this, because through generation to generation, they became modified. So that is what we have unpacked with evolution. Remember, the populations change over time, but they change into complex forms. This is brought about by the environment, and the present day life forms that you see today may have descended from and may be related to the ones or the organisms that lived before. They may not necessarily look the same. So that is what evolution is saying. So that is the essence of evolution. Right. So we're going to now look at evolution as a theory. Now we come into this word where your exam guideline was requiring you to know, but we're going to differentiate. Remember, it said you must be able to differentiate between a hypothesis and a theory. Now, the theory, it says that evolution as a theory now. We're looking at evolution as a theory. It says that it is regarded as a scientific theory Why? Why? It is a scientific theory, evolution. You can go around and say the theory of evolution because the various hypotheses relating to evolution, they have been tested and verified over time. For something to become a theory, many scientists must have tested it and come up with the same results or similar results for it to be widely accepted. And then if the science community accepts it widely, not all, but widely, then it becomes a theory. That is how evolution became a theory. It is a theory because the hypotheses were tested that are relating to this over time, that were relating to evolution. However, evolution, it is not a law. Remember, it is not a law. Not all scientists support it. You today can still come up with an explanation of how you think organisms evolved. Then it means you are not agreeing with the current theory that we go with. For it to become a law, it must not be questionable. Everyone, everywhere, when they test, they get the same results and you agree with no question. We can take a look at the laws that you are familiar with, like the Newton's second law of motion, where you put, when you exert a force on an object, the object will move in the direction of that force. That is a given. If you do it on Mars, you do it on the Earth, it will happen the same. Then it becomes a law. The law of gravity. You put something up, it will come down. Nothing is going to change that. So that becomes a law. However, please note, evolution is a theory. It has been widely tested. The hypothesis has been widely tested and accepted by the science community. Now, what evidence did they use to support the theory of evolution? So if you take a look at this slide, you see that there's evidence for evolution in general. In your first column here, you see we are discussing the evidence for evolution that was used by scientists to support or to test their hypothesis. Then the evidence for human evolution. Remember, humans also evolve. So there must be some evidence that scientists have to support the evidence of human evolution. So we're going to look at that. Also, the evidence to support the out of Africa hypothesis. There is evidence for everything in the science world. So let us take a look at the first one. We are going to discuss this later on in the presentation, but for now, please take note of the things that were used to support the theory of evolution. The first one that was used is fossil records. Fossil records, you know this from grade 10. You know what are fossils. So those fossils, they are going to be dated, they're going to be arranged in the sequence. Then you find transitional species, you find the original, the oldest, the newest. Those are the fossils. And then you have different types of fossils. We're going to look at that later. Then modification by descent or comparative anatomy. You even do this today. The second one. You check if something is related to something, you check the phenotype, the physical characteristics that it has. So when you see the physical characteristics, you know that this thing is related. It has a similar structure of the arm or it has the similar what. So that is the evidence for evolution that they used. Biogeography. Biogeography means where were these organisms situated on the planet? Are they closely related? Does it show that they come from the same continent, the same country, the same? So it's about the geography of living organisms. Where were these living organisms situated on the map? Then the last thing that the scientists use is genetics. When they use genetics, they compare now your nitrogenous bases or the nucleotides of your DNA, the sequencing of the nitrogenous bases, the number of the nitrogenous bases. Then they are able to tell that this thing is related, this organism is related to this one, due to the fact that the nitrogenous bases are similar or they have the same number or something that they will get in genetics. Right. For human evolution, what evidence did they use? Fossil records. Fossil records such as your Australopithecus. If you have been to Maropeng, you've had the the opportunity to go there, you shall have seen the fossil records that shows you the evidence for human evolution. You are going to study this later when you do human evolution. You're going to know them and name the fossils that support human evolution that were discovered here in Kenya, in Africa, all over. Right. The cultural evidence also was used to support the theory of evolution. Cultural evidence refer to situations like the complexity of the brain, where you find organisms using tools now, making fire. The scientists or the paleontologists and anthropologists were able to come up with ways or to define that these are the organisms that started using fire, or these are the organisms that started using tools made by stones or rocks or whatever. Then they also use genetics also to support the human evolution, where the nitrogenous bases of organisms were compared. That's why we are closely related to the chimps, but you will learn that later in the term, or later in the weeks, as you learn more about evolution. Then the out of Africa hypothesis. I know you may not be familiar with what is the out of Africa hypothesis. So it simply means that all hominids originated in Africa, but you're going to learn about that later. There is also evidence to support that. They used fossils to support that. They used cultural evidence. They also used genetics to support that. So evolution is a theory based on this evidence that they use to support it. But can we just tackle this? I know I have not explained this to you first, but I would like for you, just with what I have said, can you differentiate between a hypothesis and a theory? So by giving me definitions. So I will just give you 1 minute to think about this. 1 minute, then you think, what is a hypothesis and what is a theory? Right. I think you have taken your time to think about this. So let us take a look at the definitions. What is a hypothesis and what is a theory? Then you'll be able to differentiate. First, a hypothesis, remember in life sciences, it's a practical subject. When you do your practical investigation, you are expected to come up with a hypothesis for every investigation. So you must be familiar with this. So what can we say a hypothesis is? A hypothesis is a prediction. So this, you don't know, you predict. It is a prediction of a physical phenomenon that can be tested. That can be tested using observation and experiments or experiments. So what are we saying? We say, you sit down, you predict something about the physical phenomenon, but that prediction must be able to be tested so that at the end, you are able to say you reject your hypothesis or you support your hypothesis. Your observations or your experiments are going to support or reject your hypothesis. So what is a hypothesis? It's a prediction of a physical phenomenon that can be tested using what? Observations or experiments. So what can be an example of a hypothesis? Remember, there's a formula to stating a hypothesis. You don't just say something is a hypothesis or a prediction. I know once you say prediction, most of you will be tempted to say, I think, I predict. No. when you formulate a hypothesis, it must be in a form of a statement, and a statement that you are sure of. Remember, what is going to prove that statement right or wrong? It is the observations or the experiments that you are going to do actually. So let us take a look at an example that we can use for a hypothesis. Now, before we define a theory. Now, this example that we have here, it says the high incidence of HIV and AIDS is due to the lack of education about the causes of the disease. Now, this person who was coming up with this hypothesis or formulating this hypothesis, they sat down and thought about this and said, no, the high incidence of HIV is due to the lack of education about the disease. Someone might come and have a different prediction. How do we solve that? We test or we observe, we do the investigations to prove our hypothesis. Remember, our hypothesis is not a final answer. Our hypothesis is at the beginning stage where you think what the answer could be. Then you predict. So this person was just predicting it is due to the lack of education. Some of you may come and say, no, it is due to the ignorance of people, or due to whatever reason. But whatever reason that you are going to investigate, it must be supported by results of an experiment or an observation. So that is how you formulate your hypothesis. And if you take a look at the statement, it is not written, I think. The person was not saying they were thinking. They were just telling us this statement as if they were sure. It is up to us and them to test it and prove it otherwise. Now, let's go to a theory. How are we going to define the term theory? A theory is a widely held explanation of a phenomenon that is supported by numerous observations, experiments, and scientific evidence. Going back to what we said about evolution, remember, evolution is a theory. Now, how is it a theory? Because it is widely accepted. Most scientists in the science community accept the theory of evolution because they did what? They did observations, experiments, and the scientific evidence to support it. So it is therefore widely held or widely supported. So for it to become a theory, it must be widely held and widely supported due to the observations, experiments, and the scientific evidence that supports it. So let's take a look at an example of a theory. Now, the sun is the center of the universe, around which all the planets revolve. This is known as the heliocentric theory. This is not law. Most of you may have thought this is a law, but some of you sitting there may say, no, I think the sun and all the planets are arranged in a linear way. Then it is up to you now to say the sun and the planets are arranged in a linear form. Then you are going to do what? You're going to do your observations, you're going to do your experiments, and provide us with the scientific evidence to support your statement or to support your hypothesis. So then if it is widely accepted or most scientists agree to it, then it will become a theory. So for this, we believe in it for now because this is the evidence that we have. No one has said it is true. Some scientists may still believe otherwise. Hence, heliocentric theory is a theory, but not a law. I think at this moment, you are able to distinguish between a hypothesis, a theory, and a law. There's a bonus for you in there of a law. So let us go deeper now into the evidence that they used for evolution. The first one is fossil records. So fossil records. So if you take a look at this diagram, you are able to see it's a fossil of an organism there. It is an imprint. So it is not a fossil that is fossilized minerally. It is an imprint, but it's still a fossil. Then biogeography. Remember, we said biogeography, where these organisms are found. Remember. Then homologous structures. This is where we look at the anatomy. Remember the arrangement of the anatomy. Then the homologous structures means that. Then genetics can also be used, the DNA, the nitrogenous bases on the DNA to explain that. So when we look at this, the fossil records. How do they use the fossil records to support or to provide evidence for evolution? Remember, with the fossils, the paleontologists, anthropologists, they would dig into the sediments and find fossils or find fossils everywhere, whatever type of fossils. The first thing is they would have to date them. Then when they date the fossils, they are able to arrange the fossils in sequence to say this is the oldest fossil, this is the intermediate fossil or the transitional species, this is the earliest or the newest fossil. Now, that will provide evidence of descended from or related to. Remember, they will be checking the structure, they will be checking everything, but they will be using those fossils now to support what? Evolution. So there are transitional species there, which are those that displays characteristics in between. So for a fossil, when they date the fossils, they are going to date them to say this one is for this particular era, and then they find another one, and then they would find another fossil that may share characteristics of the previous and the following species. Now that one, we call it a transitional species. So when they do that and align them, it will provide evidence for evolution. With biogeography, excuse me, right, with biogeography, you have the location, the current location of closely related species. It is an indication of how they may have evolved from a common ancestor. Remember, when you look at your map, those of you who are doing geography, but even if you're not doing geography with life sciences, you are now going to be familiar with your map, with how the world was in the beginning. Then when you check the continents or the spacing between the continents, when you look at a particular organism, you will be able to tell that this organism may be closely related to the organism that is found on the next continent, because they may have been closely situated, or they may have been closely located, or they arose from a common ancestor from this particular area. So that is how it is going to give what is this? Evidence. Now, what brings about that separation? You're going to learn about it later. This word here, continental drift and speciation. How do they become different? You're going to learn how do they become different when they arose from a different ancestor, and then what made them or what separated them. It is the continental drift. Then you're going to learn about that. Then the biogeography is then going to support the evidence for evolution. Then genetic evidence, the similarities between the composition of the DNA. Remember, we spoke about the nitrogenous bases or the nucleotides of a DNA of organisms. They will be comparing those to check if they are closely related. Then it will provide evidence of evolution, of that relatedness, of that descendment. Then cultural evidence, it is the complexity, remember, of items such as artifacts that we're using. Remember, there were other organisms that were drawing on walls, on rocks, yes, and then others were using tools, they were using that. So they are able to use that cultural evidence as evidence for evolution. Now, when you take a look at this slide here, you see we have different types of fossils, or the fossil records that we have. The first type of fossil that you can have is a mold or a cast. If you see here, you take a look at this, these look like footprints of a particular organism. And then when it opens a hole, and then you can put a mold in there, then it will bring out your food, or the imprint, not the imprint, it will bring out that mold to life, to say this was the size of the food, this is what particular organism and whatnot. Then mineralized fossils. All of you are familiar with this one. Mineralized fossils are those fossils that you just dig, and then you find them as they are. You find them having had mineralized. And then in grade 10, you learn about the process of fossil formation, where you see your sedimentary rocks, you see how a fossil forms. Now, this is that type of fossils that you are going to find under the ground that have mineralized, and then it stays preserved in that form. Another type of fossil that you can find is a preservation in natural matter. So if you can take a look at this fly here, it is a fly in its entirety. but it is now embedded in some form of a jelly-like or whatever substance that is a natural substance to preserve it the way it is. So in that way, it stays there for number of years, and then it can become a fossil that can be studied over the years to come. And then a living fossil. The story of a living fossil is a very interesting one. You see we have a coelacanth here. In grade 10, you learn about the coelacanth. The coelacanth is the biggest fish that was living on earth or in water. Over a number of, it was thought to have been extinct with the dinosaurs. But somewhere in 1936, 1938, I'm not sure, I can't remember, it was found in the southern coast of South Africa, that is in PE, by one of the fishermen and his son. So then the scientists looked back to say, no, but we thought the coelacanth has been extinct with the dinosaurs, but now it was found in the southern coast of South Africa. That is why now the coelacanth here is regarded as a living fossil. So these are the types of fossils that you can find. Right. The fossil records that are kept. You see here, this is your ground, or I can say, yes, going down the ground, your sedimentary rocks. Remember the top surface, this is your timeline showing the time from the past to the most recent. So the top layer or the top sedimentary rock would represent your newest rocks, meaning the fossils that you find here will be your newest fossils. But the fossil that you find here is your oldest fossil. Remember, now the scientists will record where they found where they found the fossil, and they would date it also. Then they would find that this one is actually older than this one is older than this one is older than this one. So that these are the sedimentary rocks. So the fossil records that we have are these ones, the mineralized ones, the imprints, and your normal fossils that you see. Right? Now, the oldest rock strata are found deepest in the earth, while the youngest rocks occur nearest the surface. So this will be your surface. This is where we are working near the surface. But now your youngest are found here. Then fossils are organisms found in the deepest strata. Therefore, they lived on Earth much longer ago than those species which are fossilized near the surface. So we have already covered that by looking at the sedimentary rocks formed there. Right. Now we're going to look at biogeography. Remember, I said even if you are not doing geography as a subject, but now you are going to understand how biogeography works. Now, during biogeography, there was a period called the Permian period. If you remember your grade 10 work, you will remember the epoch, the era, and the period. Now we're talking about the period. During the Permian period, all continents were joined to form one land mass. So during that, then, if you can take a look at this diagram here, this is just one huge land mass. So it happened during which period? During the Permian period. The animals could move across. They could just move from one large land masses to the other. They were able to move across because this land mass was closely arranged. It was just one. It was not divided. Then the plants could also spread across the land masses again. Remember grade 11, how seed dispersal works and how plants may grow. So it was happening easily during the Permian period when everything was just on one land mass that was called Pangea. Please take a note of that. I'm sorry you can't see again. Right. Then the following era, it is the Triassic era. No, not the era. My pardon. Period, because era is something else also. The Triassic period. What happened during the Triassic period? Two main land masses were visible. So if you can take a look at this, there was some form of separation there. What was happening during this now? It formed this landmass, your first one, which is Laurasia, and your second one, which is Gondwana land. Now, during Triassic period, we have now two land masses. Then the animals and plants on the northern landmass, the northern landmass is this one. It is your Laurasia, were separated from those in the south. So this is the separation that we are talking about. So the plants here and animals were just living a different life, and these ones were also living their different life due to the separation during this period. Please take note, Triassic period, two land masses, which are Laurasia and Gondwana land. Then there was a Cretaceous period. What was happening during this period? Now, this is the present day position of continents. So you do know how many continents we have. This is the period that we are living in. Now, if you take a look at this, we have Europe, Asia, Africa, India, Australia, and South America. Those are your continents, meaning there was further separation. After that separation where there were two land masses, now there are no two land masses, rather different continents as stipulated on this. Then this was caused by what we call continental drift. You will learn more about that when you talk about speciation. Now, during the movement of the continents, some parts sank below the oceans and some they formed mountains. And then some they rose to form these 5 continents. Now you can think what happens to the organisms living here, organisms living here, living here. Obviously, there's going to be some similarity to show the descent. So you are going to have to prove now with evidence for evolution to say these organisms that were found here and found here may have descended from a common ancestor because of the position of the or the location of where they are on the map. Right. So continental drift in summary, remember the first period, it was Pangaea, 1 landmass. The second period, it was 2 landmasses, Laurasia and Gondwana land. Then you have the modern world with continents. Here are your continents. You see your continents there. So if you take a look at this diagram of the bird species, these are flightless birds, you can see that these flightless birds may look similar, but they are not exactly the same. It gives us the evidence that they may have descended from a common ancestor. Now, the effect of continental drift on biogeography is that it provides the evidence for evolution for ancient species. So ancient species, we're going to see where they come from. For example, the flightless birds of the southern hemisphere. Now, if you take a look at this, these Africa, South America, and Australia, they are now the continents that you find on the south. That is where now the flightless birds are. Then it will give you an idea or evidence as to how it supports evolution. Now, biogeography therefore provides evidence for evolution. Now we're going to deal with questions. Right. So let us take a look at the first question. It says, the map below shows fossils found on different land masses. So you see there are fossils there. This is the first fossil, second one, third one, and the fourth one. But on the map, they are a bit darker. So they are zoomed out here so you can see them. You can see them properly. Now you're going to check where are they located on the map. Fortunately for you, a map is outlined with the line to show you the same type of species or the same type of organism that is found on different land masses. Right. So for your first question, I'm going to give you time just to work on this. I think I will give you just 2 minutes as this is a simple activity, but let's go through the questions before we start our time. Now, name the supercontinent from which the land masses shown on the map had originated. Then you're going to give us an answer for that. Then you're going to use the map. From the map, identify 2 reptiles common to both Africa and South America. Then you're going to look at that from the map. Name 2 land masses on which the Listerosaurus had existed. Now you're going to give us that. So I'm going to give you just, I think 1 minute. 2 minutes is too much to go through this. 1 minute. Right. So let us just recap on the questions. Remember, if you do have any questions, just WhatsApp us on 079 454 9535. Right. Name the supercontinent from which the land masses shown on the map had originated. Remember, the supercontinent where there's just one. So which one is that? It is going to be Gondwanaland. Remember when I said to you, please remember that? So that supercontinent is your Gondwanaland. Now, from the map, identify two reptiles common to both Africa and South America. You have your Sinognathus and your Mesosaurus. So your Sinognathus and Mesosaurus. How do you get the names? Because some of you may say, where do we get the names? Remember, you must be able to read a diagram. So your Africa and South America. So this is Africa, this is South America. So the one that is common to both is this one. Now you check what is the shape, or yes, the shape that is mimicked by this. So you go to your diagrams here. So that is how we found them. Then you check another one. Where is the other one that existed? Here. So this one and these ones are the ones that existed in Africa and South America. So that is why you have two answers, your Sinognathus and your Mesosaurus. Then name the two landmasses on which the Lystrosaurus had existed. So the Lystrosaurus is which one? You're going to check here. The shape of the Lystrosaurus is this one. So where was this one? The two landmasses where this one was found. You have your answer there. So it was found where? In Africa. In Africa, do you find it? Here. Here it is in Africa. You find it in India. Here it is. Remember, we are following the shape because these are now shaded and smaller and dark. Then your Antarctica. In your Antarctica also, we are going to look at it here. So that is how you were able to work out your answer. Right? Now, again, okay. State the phenomenon related to the Earth's history that the fossil data shown in the map supports. So this one, I'm not going to give you time to think about it because it's just 1 mark. Now let's take a look. So what phenomenon that is related to the Earth's history that supports this? What is on the map? It says that the land masses were once joined and over time they had split, or there was a continental drift taking place. So continental drift had taken place. So it shows that if these are found in different continents, before everything was just one landmass and then it was separated, or continental drift took place. So it supports that. Then the next question. The present day distribution of three closely related species of the dog family, the coyote, jackal, and dingo, is shown in the world map below. So you see on this world map, you find the coyote there towards the top, the jackal, you find it there towards the south, and the dingo, you find it here. So these are the three species that are in the dog family that we are thought to be related. Then what type of evidence for evolution is represented here? Number 2, what is a biological species? Remember, on your exam guideline, you are expected to be able to define the term biological species, which you have been explaining or defining from grade 10. Now, I can give you 1 minute to work through the two questions in 1 minute. Right. Thank you for taking your time to answer these questions. Now, what type of evidence for evolution is represented here? It's a giveaway. You must be able to collect these marks for free. It's biogeography. What are you looking at? The map, the location of these organisms on the map. Right. Now, what is a biological species? This one, it carries 3 marks. It must have all aspects in it for it to be correct. If one aspect is missing, you are not defining a biological species. So what are those 3 things that you need to look at? So the first thing, it is your biological species are similar organisms or organisms with the same characteristics or similar organisms. That is one. The organisms, for them to be species, they must be similar. 2, the organisms must be able to interbreed. So similar organisms that are able to interbreed, meaning breeding amongst themselves. Then they must be able to produce a fertile offspring. With that breeding, they must be able to produce a fertile offspring. They must qualify all these 3 characteristics or all these 3 aspects for them to be called one species. So for it to be a species, it must be the same characteristics or similar organisms that are able to interbreed and produce a fertile offspring. If there's no fertile offspring, not the same species. If they're not able to interbreed, not the same species. So all 3 must be there for it to be a species. Please remember that it carries 3 marks also in the exam. Now, another questions that we can look at is the pothos and the lemurs are small mammals. Scientists believe that pothos and lemurs share a common ancestor. They believe that existed in Africa. Now, those are our scientists. Presently, pothos only occur in Africa, while lemurs are only found in Madagascar. Already, you just thinking. Now, Madagascar is an island of the east coast of Africa, as shown in the diagram. So this is the east coast of Africa. So this is our east. This is the Africa continent goes up there, right? This is the east side. Now, here is an island. Remember, an island has to be a water in between. So Madagascar is an island there, as shown in this diagram. So in Madagascar, we find only the lemurs, and then in Africa, we find our pothos. Now, explain how continental drift could have affected the distribution of the common ancestor. Right. So here you need to explain how continental drift could have affected the distribution of the common ancestor. I will give you also 1 minute to think about it. I know it maybe seem unfair, but 1 minute is the time I can give. Just think about it. Right. So let us recap on the question again. Explain how continental drift could have affected the distribution of the common ancestor of the lemurs and the pothos. Remember, the scientists think that they may have arose from a common ancestor. So now, how do you collect marks for such a question? Firstly, you must tell us there was once one large continent. Remember, before you go to separation, what separated? You must tell us there was one. That one, something then needs to happen with that one. Then what happened to it? what was happening in that one landmass or that one large continent. Or you can say a landmass here. Now, the common ancestor existed throughout this continent. Remember when we started, we said when there was one landmass, there was just free movement of all. So the common ancestor was existing throughout that one large continent. You get a mark for that. Then remember, you are not answering in general. You must actually refer to the organisms that are referred to in the extract, in the diagram also. Now, when Madagascar separated, you see, remember we said there was a separation here, meaning Madagascar was here, and then it separated. You can even see, you can even follow the shape or the outline shape of the island, and also the outline shape of the southeast coast of Africa. You can see where Madagascar was attached, sort of. Now, when Madagascar separated, you get a mark for saying that. The common ancestor was found in both regions. Remember, it existed initially throughout. So when you separate, there will be common ancestor this side. There will also be a common ancestor this side. So you get a mark for saying that. So in both regions, there was initially the common ancestor. So that is how you answer your question. Let's go back. So remember, it says how it had affected the distribution. So how was it distributed? It was just distributed to both. That is where you get your answer. But you must start from where? From initially how they were. So I think this brings us to the end of my presentation. And then my partner here, Raydeen, will continue with the second part. Thank you so much. Please continue to ask your questions on WhatsApp.
grade 12 learners. Welcome back to today's Life Sciences lesson. My name is Radine Kruger, and I'll be continuing with the introduction to evolution. Remember, you can send us questions on the WhatsApp line, which is 079 454 9535. Okay, so let's have a look. I'm going to carry on with the evidence that we have for evolution. And what we're going to have a look at now is what we call modification by descent. Okay, so in other words, organisms have become modified through the generations. Okay, so as the descendants appeared, so then modifications occurred. Now, the first, or the thing that we look at, the aspect that we look at this is what we call homologous structures. And remember, you've learned what the word homo means. Okay, so homo means the same, and logos means the same position or structure. So when we have a look at homologous structures, we're looking at organisms that possibly live in different environments. So they won't all live in the same type of environment. For example, some might live in water, some might live on land, some might live in the air, such as birds and bats. So they have, the structures are adapted to different environments, okay? And their function of their appendages, and that is your limbs, your attachments, has changed. And because of that, we say that because even though that the function is different, we look at the structure, and if we have a look at the structure, we see that it's similar. And that then gives us evidence that although these organisms all live in different environments, they came from what we call a common ancestor. So if we have a look at the examples, the diagrams they've given here, here's a human arm, there's a cat's forelimb, there's a whale's flipper, and then there's a bat wing. And if we look at the diagram, we can see that the bone structure, okay, you can see that they've colored in the bones that are the same. So over here, we can see the humerus is the same. So each of the organisms that is mentioned here has that bone. Even if the structure is slightly different, it is there. Then if we have a look further down, so we can see that all the bones that make up what we call a pentadactyl limb are there. Okay, so there we can see the radius and the ulnar. We can see the wrist bones, we can see the hand bones and the finger bones. Same in all four of the different organisms. Okay, except that structurally they are slightly different. So basically, the fact that mammals have the same pentadactyl limb, penta means 5, they have that limb, the structure, that suggests that all mammals then descended or originated from a common ancestor, and that the limbs have been modified over time in the different species because of the environment that they live. Okay. Right, so modification of skeletons by descent is therefore evidence that supports the theory of evolution. All right, let's have a look at a quick question based on our homologous structures. Again, here you see the diagram, and here they've actually included 5 different organisms. You can see there's a man, a cow, a horse, a whale, a bird, and each of those limbs are used for something else. Right, the diagram below shows the structure of the 4 limbs in different species. So firstly, the first question they ask is name the line of evidence for evolution represented by the diagram. And secondly, they ask you to describe how the line of evidence mentioned in question 1 supports the theory of evolution. Okay, I'm going to give you 30 seconds to think about this question and answer it. Okay, so let's have a look at the answers. All right, so we said the first question was name the line of evidence for evolution that is represented by the diagram. Remember we said homologous structures form the line of evidence called modification by descent. Or we could just give the answer homologous structures. All right, and then to describe how the line of evidence mentioned supports the theory of evolution, is that although the different species have similar bone structure or body plan, they have the structures are adapted to perform different functions, because remember we said they live in different environments. However, this does show us, that there was a common ancestor. Okay, so that they arose from a common ancestor. All right, the next line of evidence we're going to have a look at is genetics. And if we have a look at the table that they've given us here, there's organism pairs. So they've compared something to do with the number of amino acid differences of a certain molecule. If we look, there's humans, and then humans are paired with a whole lot of different organisms. And if we look at the first one with chimpanzee, there's 0 differences in the amino acid chain. Fruit flies, there's 29 differences. Horse, there's 12. Pigeon, there's 12. Rattlesnake, there's 14. Rhesus monkey, there's 1. Screwworm fly, there's 27. Snapping turtle, there's 15. And tuna fish, there's 21. All right, so now, how is that evidence of evolution? Well, first of all, the more similar the nucleotide sequence of organisms are, the more closely related they are. Remember, a nucleotide sequence we find in DNA, and DNA codes for proteins. So your DNA consists of your genes, and it's the genes that determine what the organism is. And that's why they say that the less the differences in the DNA, the more closely related they are. Okay, so if we have a look, for example, chimpanzees, we see that there's a 97% similarity between the sequence of DNA of a human and a chimpanzee, and then obviously 99% similarity with other humans. Right, this suggests that humans are more closely related to each other than any other animal, but more closely related to chimpanzees than mice, for example. All right, so therefore, we may share a common ancestor. All right, so let's have a look at some questions. In this one, we get some information where they say scientists compare the number of differences in the amino acid sequence. So there they're looking at the amino acid sequence to see how closely related species are. Fewer differences means the species are more closely related. Remember we said that. Now, cytochrome C is a protein that occurs in many species. The amino acid sequence of this protein differs between species. Now, the table below shows the number of differences in that amino acid sequence of 3 species. They don't tell us what they are. They just call them A, B, and C. Okay, so if we have a look at the table, here we can see species A and species B. And if we compare that amino acid sequence between those two, we find that there are 11 differences. If we look at species A and we compare them to species C, we find that there are only 3 amino acid differences. If we compare species B to species C, we see that there are 10 differences. Okay, so that's basically what the information that they've put in the table. Now, the first question they ask us is what type of evidence for evolution is being used for this table? When we have a little bit more difficult questions, I'll give you time, but for now, we're just going to go through the answer. And the type of evidence, because we are looking at genes or amino acid sequence, which is coded from a gene or from the DNA, we are looking at genetic evidence. Okay. Right, then the next question. Okay, so here I'll give you a minute to have a look. So what they ask us, that from that same table, that data they've put in the table, they ask us to give the letter, so only the letter, we're not going to write down anything else, of species A, B, and C that should appear in positions 1, 2, and 3 in the diagram below. So if we have a look at this diagram, can you see it's a cladogram? So we have a common ancestor, okay, at the bottom. Then a speciation event occurred, and that common ancestor was split. So now they become these two branches. And if we have a look, go further up the first branch, we see that it splits again. Okay, so we have one species and another species on that first branch, and the third species then on the second branch completely. So now what you need to do is tell us which species, A, B, or C, would we find at position 1, 2, and 3. Okay, I'm going to give you 1 minute to think about that. Okay, so let's have a look at the answer. Right, so remember when we looked at the table first, we said that if we compare species A and species B and C, it looks like species C is more closely related to species A, whereas species B is not very closely related to A or C. Okay, so let's apply it to the diagram. Okay, so when we have a look at the clad or the diagram here, we see that 1 and 2 appear on the same, on that first branch, and then they were separated. So they seem to be more closely related than number 3. So let's see which letters would we put where. Okay, so number 1 would either be A or C. Okay, we could either put A or C there because we said they were closely related. And then number 2 could either be C or A, depending on what you've said for number 1. And then the one that is the least related to those two would then be B. Okay. Right, let's have a look at some more questions. Okay, so this is a multiple choice question, and very often we have the impression that multiple choice questions are easy. It's not necessarily the case, because in this question you can see they've given quite a lot of data. So you first have to read through all that data and then get to the answer. And the other thing is, remember, never ever leave a blank space for a multiple choice question. If you're not sure of the answer, start by a process of elimination where you first cross out the ones that you know are incorrect, the answers they've given, or the distractors that they've given. Cross out the ones you know for sure are wrong. And then say you're left with 2 and you're still not 100% sure. Choose one of them because you've got a 50% chance of getting it correct. Okay, so remember that you don't ever leave a multiple choice question out. All right, so let's have a look. The first part of the question, they say the table below shows the number of differences. Again, they've said it, differences in the amino acid sequence of a protein. And this protein that they have compared or sequenced here is called albumin, okay, which we find in 4 species of primates. Now, the species that they're looking at is once again human, gorilla, gibbon, and a monkey. So if we have a look at the comparison between a human and a monkey, we see that there are 32 differences. Between a gorilla and a monkey, there are also 32. Between a gibbon and a monkey, there are 32. And obviously between a monkey and a monkey, there's no differences. Human and a gibbon, there's 14. And human and a gorilla, there's 8. gorilla and a gibbon, there's 14 and obviously 0. And then a gibbon, well, we've already been through. Okay, so that's the data that they've given us. Now, from that data, you need to say which two species are likely to have separated most recently. Now, what does that mean? Those that have separated most recently means that they are the most closely related. And remember, we said when organisms are closely related, they would have fewer differences. The more differences are, the less closely related they are, and then would have separated earlier on. So if we have a look and we see which two are more closely related, it seems to be the humans and gorillas. Okay, so there's only 8 differences. So that would then be, the answer would be D. Okay, so let's see. Yes, we are correct. All right. Let's go to the next question. Also a multiple choice question. And once again, there's quite a lot of information given that you first need to read through, and then you can answer the question. So again, they've sequenced amino acids of the hemoglobin molecule. Remember, you learned about hemoglobin in grade 10 with blood. That's the red pigment that we find in our blood. And they sequenced that to determine how closely related different species are to each other. Following table shows the amino acid sequence of a small portion of hemoglobin of various species. So they've looked at a human, a horse, a gorilla, chimpanzee, and zebra. And here they've given the amino acid sequence, so we can see these are the 4 amino acids that we find in humans. These would be the 4 amino acids in a horse, in a gorilla, in a chimpanzee, and a zebra. Okay. So that's for the section of hemoglobin. Now, assuming that the amino acid sequence is the same for the rest of the molecule, which two species are the most closely related? So we need to have a look and see which ones would have the similar or same amino acid sequence in the table. So if we have a look at humans and we have a look at chimpanzee, okay, we can see that they have exactly the same sequence. So therefore, our answer again would be D. So humans and chimpanzees would be the most closely related. So let's see if we are right. Yes, that is correct. Okay, let's go to the next set of questions. If we have a look at the diagram here, we see that again they've given us the structure. It looks like limbs of different organisms. The first one is a forelimb of a bat. And remember, you must know the difference between a forelimb and a hind limb. Okay, so the forelimb is usually in humans would be your arm, and your hind limb would be your leg. All right, so we've got a forelimb of a bat and the forelimb of a crocodile. We also have a limb of an octopus and a limb of an insect. Okay, they say, give only the letters of the diagrams that represent homologous structures. Okay, so you're only going to look at the letters. Right, that's all they want. And remember, you need to follow the instructions. So you're not going to write down the name of the limb. You're only going to give the letter. Okay, so those that then represent homologous structures, if we have a look here, we can see there doesn't seem to be any similarity between the limb of the octopus and the limb of the insect. But if we have a look at the forelimb of the bat and the forelimb of a crocodile, we can see that the bone structure is similar. Okay, so let's have a look if we are correct. So our letters that we need to write down would be A and C. Okay, then the next question says, describe how homologous structures provide evidence for evolution. And that's, so now we're going to describe. Okay, so we've got to give a little bit of a description. And the way in which they provide evidence is that organisms that have similarities in structure, okay, so although they might not be used for the same thing, but there are similarities, indicates that there was common ancestry. So they came from a common ancestor. Okay, and that shows that there was evolution that took place. Right, then the last question for this one, it says, besides studying homologous structures, name 2 other sources that scientists use as evidence for evolution. Okay, and remember we said we've already covered that there was fossil evidence, there was biogeography, and there was genetic evidence. All right, so let's have a look. Fossil record, biogeography, genetics. And please note, can you see here, we put this, or examiners, when they set papers and they write this on the memo, it means that whoever's marking your question paper is only going to mark your first 2 answers. Even though there are 3 answers and you can give any 3 of those, okay, but they're only going to mark your first 2. So if your first one is incorrect, you're only going to get 1 mark. So remember, when you do use past papers, it's very important that you do understand how and use the memo so that you can learn and see how marking takes place in life sciences and you can benefit. All right. Okay, now we're going to move on to the next topic, which says sources of variation. And remember, what was variation? When did we learn about variation? Well, we learned about variation when we studied genetics. Okay, and we learned that variation is when organisms don't have exactly the same DNA. Okay, so these are slight differences. And what that does generally in a population, if there is variation, it actually improves the chances of survival. Right, so variation actually in a population is very important. So all the organisms mustn't be exactly the same, because if they're all identical, they all have exactly the same genetics, if the environmental conditions change, then the whole population will die out. Okay, and so this is why variation is so very important in evolution, because it is what determines how the population adapt to a certain set of environmental conditions and how the population changes or survives, or those that survive. So now the different sources of variation. The first one is mutation. And mutations you also learned when we did DNA and genetics. And basically a very basic definition of mutation is a sudden, okay, and it's unexpected. We don't know when it's going to happen. We don't really know what causes it to happen. It's random in the genetic structure or the DNA of a cell. So there are different types of mutation, and in different contexts, like genetics and DNA. You must know the difference between a gene mutation and a chromosome mutation. But here we basically just want to know what is the effect, or how does a mutation cause variation. So if we have a look at the diagram here, you can see this is a DNA strand. They say the original DNA code for an amino acid sequence. And here we've got the different nuclear or nitrogen bases or nucleotides, and there's different. Okay, so, and usually when we look at DNA, we look at 3 nitrogen bases as a code, because that when it forms mRNA, it forms the codon, and tRNA has the anticodon. So we have a look at 3 bases together, and they would code then for a specific amino acid. Now, if we have a look at the second diagram, so when DNA replication took place another time, what happened is that there was an error or a misreading. So in this amino, or in this codon, or this set of this base triplet, we see that instead of an A C replaced the A, and that then caused, it then coded for a different amino acid. So now instead of histidine being the amino acid that should be placed there, we find now that there's a different amino acid, proline. So now we have the incorrect amino acid, which may either change the structure of the protein and it might function, or it might create a malfunctioning protein. But if the protein is able to function, and that is how we have then found different forms of genes. So, for example, originally there was brown eyes and blue eyes. And if we have a look at human beings, we find all the ranges of eye color. There's some people with blue eyes, gray eyes. Some people even say there's some with purple or violet colored eyes, green, all different shades. Some have very dark brown eyes, some have very light blue eyes. And those are all mutations that have taken place. Okay, so when a mutation occurs, it doesn't always have to be lethal. If it doesn't affect the functioning of the organism can function and still live, then they would then carry over that mutation to their offspring when they reproduce, because they didn't die. Right, so a source of variation then would be mutations. Another source of variation occurs in meiosis, and this we learned at the beginning of the year. So again, we see that there's genetic variation that occurs in the gametes, and remember, the gametes is what produces offspring. So when we are producing gametes and the two processes that create variation, that is what then makes the offspring of when those two gametes fertilize or fuse. That is what usually makes them different. So unless they are identical twins, offspring might look similar, but there are differences, and that is due to variation. So in meiosis, we've got two processes that take place. The first one is crossing over, and if we have a look at this diagram here, we can see that there's homologous chromosomes. One is paternal and one is maternal. So it comes from the mother and the father. And during prophase 1, we have crossing over that occurs. Okay, where the chromatids then cross over, and they then actually exchange genetic material. So now what we see is that this paternal chromosome here, or this chromatid, now came from the father, but actually has maternal DNA on it. And this one over here is the maternal chromosome. It now has paternal DNA. So if we compare this chromatid with that one, before crossing over, they were identical. Now, after crossing over, they're no longer identical. Okay, so we have now created genetic variation. All right, so crossing over results in what we call recombinant chromatids, because there's an exchange of maternal and paternal DNA. The second process that takes place during meiosis is random arrangement. Okay, so in metaphase 1, we see the chromosomes line up here on the equator, and you can see in these diagrams, there's 4 different possibilities. So here we've got all the red chromosomes on one side and the green on the other. In this one, we see that we've got 2 red on one side and only 1 green. And in this one, we see we've got 1 green, 1 red, 1 green. And here we see we've got 1 green and 2 red in a different arrangement. Okay, so what that does is it also creates genetic variation. Right, another source of variation is what we call random fertilization. So it's a chance process, because remember, males produce millions and millions and millions of sperm cells. And in humans, in human females, there's usually only 1 ovum. So, and then those sperm cells, once they are deposited inside the female's body, they then need to get to the ovum. And we don't know which of those millions of sperm cells is going to get there first. So, and every time it would be a different one. So this is why we say it's random. It's a chance process, because we cannot be sure which sperm cell will fertilize which ovum. And if you have a look in this table here, where we've got 4 different ova possibilities, and we've got 4 different sperm cells, we see that there are 16 possibilities of the different types of genetics or DNA that we find. So that is why with 4 sperm and 4 ova, there are 16 possible zygotes that can occur. All right, and then another form of evidence or of genetic variation is what we call random mating. So remember, in the animal world, not all species mate for life. So we won't have a male that has a female partner for life as we do in humans, possibly. But here, where we have a male that has possibly a harem of several females, okay, and that also increases the chances of variation. Right, now once we know where or the types or the different forms of variation, where they come from, there's questions that we can answer that are based on it. Okay, so the first question they ask us, okay, this one is on the evidence that we were given, evidence of hominid cultural evolution. So in other words, we're looking at humans, and they're talking about cultural evolution, which can be found in the fossil record, because remember, there's not only skeletons and teeth and hard parts of organisms, but there are also artifacts and things like that we find. Okay, so if we're looking at looking for cultural evidence, which would be the example or a possibility, it would include the position of the spine to the head. No, that has to do with the structure of the person, of the individual, of the organism. The length of the upper limbs compared to the length of the lower limbs. Again, we're looking at the structure of the organism. The number of teeth present in the skull. No, it's not cultural evidence. Presence of stone tools. Okay, so there we said cultural evidence is the things that organisms used, and hominids would have used stone tools. So then the answer would be D. Right, then the second question says variation within a species is introduced through random mating, which is true, but then asexual reproduction. And we know asexual reproduction produces identical organisms, so it's definitely not that answer. Mitosis. Mitosis, we know when cells divide by mitosis, two identical cells are produced, so there's no variation, so it won't be that answer. Random mating and random fertilization, we know those were two. And then the last option, they give us mitosis and meiosis. So meiosis, we know that variation occurs, but mitosis, we said, identical, so there's no variation. So therefore, the answer must be, okay, it should be C. All right, sorry, I think that moved. All right, so let's have a look at the last question here based on the sources of variation. Here they give us a list of processes below. The first one is mutation, DNA replication, meiosis, random fertilization. Now, if we have a look at that list, these three were sources of variation. DNA replication, we learned that the DNA molecule makes an identical copy of itself, so there wouldn't be any replication, any variation there. So which of the following processes are regarded as a source of variation for evolution? So the first option they give us is 1 and 2. The B is, they say 1, 3, and 4. C, they say 2, 3, and 4. And D, they say 1, 2, and 3. Okay, so we already said that DNA replication does not provide variation. So then the correct answer should be 1, 3, and 4, which is B. Oopsie, sorry. And that is B. Okay. Right, let's have a look at the types of variation. Now, this is new in the exam guideline, and it's very important that you know these two types of variation that we study. And the first one is called continuous variation. And remember, continuous means that it follows on. Okay, so these are usually characteristics where there's a range of intermediate phenotypes. For example, height, skin color, hair color. And if we have a look at this picture here, this photograph here of these girls that are at a ballet class, we can see there's variation. So there aren't just tall girls and short girls. There's a whole variety. Some are tall, some are medium height, some are very short, others are not so short. So there's a whole range of intermediate phenotypes. If we look at their skin color, we can see there's a whole range of skin colors. There isn't just light and dark. If we look at hair color, again, there's a whole range. So all of those characteristics we call continuous variation. Whereas the other type of variation we call discontinuous. And remember, when something is discontinuous, it is separated, it's broken, it's a break between. So these are characteristics that we find that fall into distinct categories. So remember dis and for discontinuous and dis for distinct. So they are in separate categories. And if we have a look at some of the characteristics that we know about is blood groups. Okay, we know you either get blood group A, you don't get A and a quarter of B, you only get A, or you get B, or you get AB, or you get O. Another one is tongue rolling. Some of you can roll your tongues, some of you can't. So it's no sort of half roll your tongue. It's roll your tongue or you can't roll your tongue. So those again are distinct categories. And then again, another example is detached earlobes. So where somebody has a little bit of a longer earlobe, whereas the other category is an attached earlobe. All right, so those are the different types of variation. Where we've got continuous, where there's intermediate phenotypes, there's a whole range, and discontinuous, where you have separate categories. Right, okay, so let's just quickly look at a summary. The continuous variation, there's no distinct categories, whereas in discontinuous variation there are. The examples are height, weight, heart rate, finger length, leaf length. Whereas discontinuous, we've got tongue rolling, fingerprints. We know everybody has their own eye color, blood groups. Usually, continuous variation, if we ask you to draw a table from the data, so we can have a whole lot of heights of different individuals, we're going to draw it as a line graph. So it then becomes a line graph. Whereas if I ask you for discontinuous variation, I'm going to ask you for a bar graph, because each of those bars represents a different category. All right, and then if we have a look at the characteristics in continuous variation, we find there's a range of phenotypes, and so often there are more than one gene that determines or controls that characteristic. Whereas in discontinuous variation, we find that there are fewer or only one gene that determines that. Right. Okay, so the last question. Here they say, study the diagram below showing evolution by natural selection in deer. Here you can see there's a population. There's white deer and there's black deer. There's the population. Some of them, they have different characteristics. Some survive and they pass on their genes to the rest of the next generation. Right, so the first question they ask is, list 3 sources of variation in a species. Remember we said the sources, the first would be mutation, okay, the second would be meiosis, and remember, if I say just meiosis, I'm only going to get 1 mark. But if I subdivide my meiosis and I say crossing over so crossing over, it should actually be random arrangement. Okay, yes, I've got random arrangement there. Okay, if I separate those two, I'm going to get 2 marks. Then the other one is random mating, and the last one would be random fertilization. Actually, that's the second last one, and mutations is the last one. So they asked us for 3, we only need to list 3. Right, the second question they say, explain why the above example represents discontinuous variation. So if we have a look at this picture, we see that there were white deer and there were black deer. Okay, so there were 2 distinct characters. There were no gray, none in between. So because of that, we then say they are into two distinct categories, and that is why we call it discontinuous variation. So the deer are either white or black. There's no intermediate characteristic, or there's no grey deer. Sorry, and therefore we classify it as discontinuous variation. All right, well, that's all we have time for. We've come to the end of our presentation. I hope that you have enjoyed it. And just to say that evolution is a really, really interesting topic. I wish you luck for your prelim exams. And remember, use practice, lots of practice using past papers, and that is how you will prepare yourself effectively for the exams, so that when you do get those exam papers, there's a possibility that you may actually have already covered some of the questions. Thank you.